afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming to this session on financing the Green Deal. My name is Vivian Coburn. I work with Scottish Futures Trust, where I lead on their energy efficiency and their low carbon work streams. We're very pleased that this session is happening today. One of the reports we published earlier this year was around local authorities and how they could become involved in this area around promoting and delivering the Green Deal. Obviously, you can promote and deliver, but the key thing is how do you then finance it? So I'm very pleased to have a panel of experts on my left who will be able to give us the overview from industry, utilities and from funders. To introduce them quickly, we've got Siobhan Webster, who's Strategic Director of Carillion Energy Services, who leads on all their energy efficiency work. Now, how you finance the Green Deal is a real intangible question to Carillion Energy Services and Siobhan at the minute, given that they were announced as the preferred partner for Birmingham City Council on Monday. So she has a target of financing, according to the press reports, it's between 600 billion and £1.5 billion of Green Deals over the next 5 to 8 years. So I'd be interested in her take on this. Sitting to Siobhan's left, we've got Callum McCosh. He's Commercial Manager with Scottish Power, leads on all the energy company obligation work for Scottish Power and how they're going to engage on the Green Deal. So we'll be able to get the utilities perspective from Callum. To his left is Paul Davies, partner at PwC, who I read with interest is the lead project deliverer for the Green Deal Finance Company in one of your recent bulletins from the Green Deal Finance Company. So you're going to get a very up-to-date take on sort of the real challenges facing the financing of Green Deal. And then finally at the left we have Adam MacDonald, who's Director of Asset-Backed Solutions at Lloyds Banking Group, so an expert in the bond market, and we're talking around how banks and the bond market can interact and help to finance Green Deal. Because obviously financing Green Deal and the cost of finance will actually influence the level of uptake and demand for Green Deal. So really, really interesting dynamics there. In terms of this session, before we kick off, we're going to follow the sort of format the other breakouts have followed. We'll each give our own perspective and then open it up for questions and answers. But perhaps to help us, it'd be useful to know how many of you feel familiar with the Green Deal and know the basics of what the Green Deal is about. Perhaps a show of hands. So about half. So hopefully we'll pitch it at the right level. So pass on to Siobhan.
Right, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us at this session. I'd asked if we could ask Vivian, we could ask that question about what we expect the knowledge of Green Deal to be in the room, because recently I think, and this has happened to a lot of us, we're talking about Green Deal at various different conferences, and actually it's quite difficult to pitch. Some of you will be very well advanced in Green Deal and others will be newer to it. So just a really, really quick overview then, essentially, of a Green Deal for Carillion Energy Services and for the industry and for consumers as a whole is just a way of, a catalyst or a way of financing energy efficiency measures to be delivered in the home and businesses. And essentially, you would go and survey a property, find out what energy efficiency measures are suitable for that property and will create savings. And the savings should then cover the cost over a period and profile of the cost of the measures and the finance of those measures, which is kind of very crude explanation of the golden rule. And individuals and businesses can put in some cash deposits to play that, but essentially that's the sort of work of the construct. And that finance mechanism is attached to the meter. So if an individual or a business leaves the property, they're not continually responsible for that loan, but it remains with the building. So obviously there's some appeal there for consumers who may be leaving in a property and they may feel they're going to sell in 5 years and they're not sure if they're going to get the payback, but they can feel the money is going to come off the bill, be achieved by the savings, and then they're not tied in going forward. So that's my quick plotted explanation of Green Deal. In terms of financing and for a business perspective, what would we need and what do we need to kind of get Green Deal up and underway? I suppose I tried to think of it quite simply. Well, at first I tried to think of something clever to say when I was on a panel, and I thought that may take me down a route, so I'll keep it really simple. And what we as businesses look for is a context that is going to stimulate a demand so that we can create our products and services and shape that context and demand. And we definitely have that in the UK and in fact globally, in terms of rising energy prices, pressures of climate change, rising fuel poverty issues, and essentially as well needing a boost for our economy. So we need a stimulus. And in that, then you can see how Green Deal can come into play and solve this and help support some of those things that we're trying to achieve. And we can build energy efficiency targets and services to be delivered into the homes and the businesses, and we can sell that into individuals, but we need a way for them to purchase and buy, and this is where the constructs of the finance and the likes of the Green Deal Finance Company come into play, because you really need volumes then to make that feasible, and how we stimulate that demand. And that's what the businesses and investors need as well, because how do we set out new products and services in a cost-effective way without volume and demand, and you get that sort of stimulus coming through. And to create volume and demand, you need stability. And certainly in investors, we need stability. And for any of you that have been involved in things like solar PV in the past and the feed-in tariffs, we saw that very much with investor confidence. Investors came into the market, a number of investors built some very innovative and effective programs, but rapid change in the policies and the framework lost that investor confidence, and we need to be very mindful of that in Green Deal. And actually interesting in the international Q&A, for any of you who are sat in there, many of the messages are exactly the same for Green Deal. We need a stable framework for investors and businesses to trust and understand and then buy from. And when you have that stability, you can stimulate volume, and then that allows the financial constructs to reach the right interest rates, because for the consumer, they need a very cost-effective solution. And when you look at Green Deal and the 46 measures that you can have under Green Deal, you very quickly get to learn, even if you have basic maths understanding like myself, the importance of what the interest rate is going to do to that savings paying off the measure calculation, and how many things can actually qualify if you don't get the volume and you don't get the right interest rate. And your list of 46 actually narrows quite considerably when you play that through. So that's incredibly important, that stability and volume demand, as is the appeal. For us as businesses, we need to be able to take what some could argue is quite a complex message, but turn it into a very basic and easy to engage with message for the consumers. So a lot of the guys that are involved in the real detail, yes, there is some complexities, but actually, it's about buying an energy efficiency measure, making your home and business warmer, and a clever way to pay that off that gives you some freedom and flexibility. That's all we're doing. We're tackling energy efficiency, tackling climate change, and I think with the associated energy company obligation as well, the importance really there of climate change, energy efficiency, and importantly, fuel poverty. And all of that can stimulate, actually, interestingly, the economy and the demand as well when we create green jobs. And associated to that, how much volume, how much drive we get is really important. And I think as an industry, we're looking to see how much Green Deal can do and how much energy company obligation can do. And we're looking into the horizon as well through things like the energy bill revolution about what more can be done with carbon tax recycling to generate even more uptake and more solution. But for today's conversation, I think really it's stability, creating a product, translating that product into an easy to absorb manner, and then creating volumes that we can all invest in the supply chain, and potentially using things like energy company obligation and the national programs can help build those early volumes in as the Green Deal volumes start to ramp up, as consumers start to come on board with that.
Thank you. Now I'll pass over to Callum for the utilities company's perspective.
Good afternoon. As Siobhan mentioned, as part of the Green Deal umbrella, there's a thing called the Energy Company Obligation, or ECO, which some of you might be familiar with. So just to talk about that, because a lot of the things that an energy company like Scottish Power would actually have in common with a company like Carillion: how do you engage customers, how do you make a compelling proposition? But we have the extra obligation part of that, where as an energy supplier, we're obligated by the UK government to do certain domestic energy efficiency measures in the UK and ensure that vulnerable customers' homes are heated to a sufficient level. And that is an obligation. We have a target, and if we don't hit the target, there's a 10% fine on our turnover. So it's very motivating for us to make sure that we hit that obligation. And the way that the structure's been put together is that DEC estimate about £1.3 billion a year will be spent by energy companies on their obligation. To be honest, the modelling that we've done, we think it will be substantially more than that. So good news for homeowners out there, because there'll be more money coming their way, I think. So how we use this 1.3 billion, if we use that number, we can combine that with Green Deal finance. And why is that important? It's important because the more finance we get into the market, either because the rate is cheaper or we can increase demand, the less we have to then spend on that obligation, and we can start to potentially try and reduce that number. That's not only good for us as a company, but obviously as this is a cost of business to an energy company, we effectively pass that back through everybody's bills. So if we can stimulate demand for finance into the market, then that will hopefully trickle through to a lower cost of delivery from an energy company, and in return a lower energy bill for everybody at the end of the day. So the key area from an energy company, looking at specifically the obligation part, is can we get the finance mechanisms in place that allow us to put a compelling offer to the customer, so that we can use our eco-subsidy to help the golden rule that Siobhan mentioned earlier, and attract more and more customers to get energy efficiency measures.
Okay, thank you, Cam. Now, Paul, the Green Deal Finance Company.
Inexorably going in a direction. There's an almost logical link here. So clearly, as I said, the golden rule is what making this tick, and to the extent that the finance is as cheap as possible, more things are under the golden rule, and the more things that can be financed, the less eco is necessary. That has to be a cash cost passed up to everyone. So it's all about getting low-cost finance. The trouble you had at the outset was to get something for government's ambition of somewhere between £3 and £10 billion worth of green deals, and you need long-term low-cost finance. And the only real source of that is the bond market, because it's low cost. You wouldn't get it from the balance sheets of the Green Deal providers, nor long-term. And at the moment for banks, their new capital adequacy rules mean that they can't lend long-term at anything but extortionate costs. So you have to go for the bond market, but the trouble is with the bond market, they tend to like tried and tested things. So normally they would come into markets when it's been going for a number of years. So you've somehow got to create some vehicle that you can quickly go to the bond markets and be of the standards and the credit quality that they expect to invest in. A second thing that is needed in the Green Deal is an administration capability to deal with the complexities of the Green Deal. Quite simply, when somebody takes out a Green Deal, they are doing that Green Deal with a provider who takes the money from a financier, who gets repaid from an energy supplier who is collecting it from the bill payer. There has to be a system that makes all those talk to one another. It has to be compatible with different ways of paying your bill, like prepayments or direct debit or fuel direct. And it has to be compatible with switching, so people can change still suppliers, and you've got to be able to trace that through and find the loans. So underlying this is quite a complex IT system and loans admin, which, believe me, is expensive to design and set up and to create. So what we sort of concluded was the best way to try and meet those two things together was create one finance vehicle, which is both a finance house of the size and quality of aggregating the loans nationally, can raise bonds against those loans, and therefore pass the price of bonds on to the consumer. It's set up as a not-for-profit. In other words, it's not there for the long-term equity ownership of the industry. It will be just passing that price as far as possible, plus costs to the consumer. And at the same time, it will have the cost of setting it up incurred once centrally, rather than a number of times around the industry, to minimise the cost of the whole industry. So that's the logic underlying the Green Deal Finance Company. In terms of where we've got to in the update, we've had a £7 million loan from DEC to make us complete those two tasks, to get the full credit rating and bless the structure for the bond market. And we've now begun a competitive outsource for the loans administration, so we'll be ready in January to do it. So we've had that. We've got now 53 members of our company, so companies who are Green Deal providers and local authorities predominantly, and industry organisations, so 53 organisations. And we've been engaging for several months now with the Green Investment Bank, so relevant to this morning, to lend us an initial loan of around £300 million to help build the book. Similarly, we're talking with the European Investment Bank to lend a higher amount in the longer term to help build the book. And then I'll pass on in a second to Adam for the private sector finance that would lead to. The intention is to have both the operational readiness and the finance ready in January on the back of initial finance, which is the mixture of a loan from our stakeholders, so our members and slightly wider than that and public and local authorities, and a loan from the Green Investment Bank. And that would be sufficient finance for the first year. At that stage, we'll have built our book and our finance behind it. So at that point, I will pass over to Adam.
So at Lloyds, we've spent probably the best part of 2 years looking at the Green Deal, and we initially looked at it as is this the next big retail banking product that we can add to our armoury? I think the bank very quickly concluded that for the reasons Paul mentioned, that it just wasn't going to be a retail bank product. I think it's been well documented and well spoken of in this conference that banks struggle with long-dated loans, but also the complexity of the loans administration, where the borrower can change over time, is beyond the capabilities of most retail banks. You actually have to create something bespoke. So it became very obvious early on that it needed to get a route to capital markets, because in the capital markets, the pension funds investors, the institutional pension fund investors, they like long-dated assets. They manage long-dated pension funds, so they have a natural home for long-dated assets. But they like projects and investments that offer large scale. So a single aggregation vehicle makes absolute sense. But they also like low-risk assets with a strong investment-grade rating. And this is where the support of industry and the Green Investment Bank is needed, particularly given the size and scale of the ambition here and the low-cost aspirations of the funding. So I attended a number of the sessions yesterday, and I think one of the themes that comes up time and time again is sort of the dearth of long-term bank finance. So I think it's worth just spending just a couple of minutes and sort of saying, well, how is the capital markets around deals like Green Deal actually galvanizing to fill some of those gaps, to provide the natural long-term source of funding that arguably they should be providing, because they like long-dated assets and infrastructure or project finance loans in the renewable sector, or even these Green Deal loans are long-dated assets. But there are quite a few positive developments that I expect to see, that the capital markets increasingly going to fill the void. In particular, in July, the government announced an infrastructure guarantee programme for £40 billion. And that's primarily aimed at trying to improve the credit quality of projects. Green Deal is one of the potential poster childs for it, but other projects, offshore wind, etc., Crossrail, etc., could be considered, whereby the government will provide just enough government support such that bonds can get a higher rating, targeting round about the single A level, whereby they can usher in lots of funding from the capital markets, lots of long-dated funding that the market needs. The government's also signed a memorandum of understanding with a group of pension funds to create a infrastructure finance platform, initially starting about $2 billion. That's due to go live next year. And we're actually starting to see a lot of infrastructure asset managers, specialist large asset managers, hiring project finance experts. So you can see the institutional investors starting to get in gear to invest in infrastructure. And one of the other things we've been picking up more recently is an interest from investors in quote-unquote green bonds. Now, no one's been precise as to what green bonds actually are. But when you sort of talk to the institutional investors, they've largely all signed up to the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. And under those, they've signed up to enshrine environmental considerations into their investment decision-making process. So a lot of the larger leading institutional investors are trying to actually work out what that means in practice. So we're seeing quite a lot of interest in quote-unquote green bonds. So that's a potentially interesting area. So I guess overall, the Green Deal Finance Company we see as the best route to market for the Green Deal. But I guess more broadly, we're seeing the stars align on the institutional market to actually start to take a considerable amount of the infrastructure financing burden from the banks.
Okay. Thank you for all those comments on the different dimensions of financing the Green Deal. I think one of the things we have to remember is, although the Green Deal was launched last week, wasn't it, that actual Green Deal plans can't be signed till January. So a lot of this is an evolving market. It's taking tried and tested financing techniques and applying it into a slightly different initiative. I'd really like to open it up to questions now. So I don't know if I've got this on there. There's a microphone coming.
Thank you. Dave Gorman from the Scottish Environment Protection Agency. Thought that was a really clear explanation between the panels, and thank you for that. Can I ask two questions? Is that allowed?
Go on.
First one is just the one about technology change. So, take PV or something. So if you've said to people, put this on your roof and I'll pay it back over a very long period, how does that work actually if the technology changes quite a bit? And thoughts on that. The second one is a more serious one, maybe about competition. If you're having an entire industry getting together by one vehicle, are the competition issues? And also, if you've got this great big chain of people passing money around between them, conflicts of interest, so that somebody who wants recourse about something, that whole question, if you know what I mean. So you've got lots of people in a chain, and is everybody in the chain aligned in the same direction towards the customer at the end of it? So, thank you.
Okay, so we'll take the first of those questions first around technology change. Siobhan, you're probably best placed to give an initial response.
I will try. So there isn't, in Green Deal, it's, if you purchased a technology through Green Deal on year one and the technology was updated in year 5, you wouldn't be able to swap the technology up. I mean, so there is an element of, you've bought that technology at that period and you stick with it a little bit. I suppose as a classic is always VHS moving to DVD. If you've bought it, you're with that. So although new technologies will be brought on and be acceptable as a Green Deal measure, once the individuals purchase that measure, that there wouldn't be a swap out there per se. There might be a bit of blur, I suppose, where an energy efficiency rating and a swap could be done where you're still creating a saving, but that's a slightly different construct. And I'll just really quickly on the competition piece, but obviously leave it more to Paul's answer. In terms of us coming together as an industry under this aggregated model, I see your point and the query, of course, but I suppose that's just one piece of the competition. To keep that really low interest rate is only one aspect of how we come into the market and deliver Green Deals. So there's still a huge amount of kind of competitive edge and layering of costs and then unique selling points that you bring and how we each come to the market. So that will be of interest to individuals and local authorities around community engagement or creating local jobs, and then our cost of install and our customer service, and there'll be retailers, and hopefully this low interest rate will mean that rather than just the classics, although as good as we are, the energy companies and companies like Carillion, you'll get other new players coming in that will create real customer service driven, and that should help part of the competition aspect.
Does anybody else want to comment on the technology point before we move on to... Yeah. Okay, well, we'll move on then to the competition point. And there is, when we talk about this we're talking about financing, and there is a statistic, I'm sure Paul will tell me, that every 1% movement in the interest rate affects demand by 5, 6, 7%. So this is really all about trying to drive down the cost of finance to the lowest point. But in that context,
the way, because we were very conscious of that right at the outset, not surprisingly, and pushed it into our articles of association. So basically, we're run by a couple of principles. Firstly, our membership is open to all, so any Green Deal provider in the market can join and would be welcome, and most have. The second is that we will be making the finance available to all, so anyone that is eligible to get a Green Deal, the idea is they get the same and at the same price. So there's a universal eligibility. We're not, the strength or size of the provider is irrelevant to us, because we're ultimately, our credit risk is the household. So it's open to all and provided to all, which is fairly helpful. We're totally open book as well, which is hopeful. And we've got government have been on our board and as an observer in all our meetings for the last year. We did go also to Ofgem to make sure we get clearance on what we're doing. We will in turn compete the underlying finance, so the bond arrangement, the warehousing, the finance that we are raising. So there is a competitive process going on to drive down the cost of finance. And no financer, again, is being disadvantaged because we're just the vehicle that is used to centralise but then go out to the market. So, Adam is our advisor, but has no God-given right to do all the arrangements of the deals. Those will be competed out in the market. Basically, ultimately, what does it mean? It means that the finance, because as Siobhan says, it makes the whole thing tick, becomes not a part of someone's competitive approach to the market, but just an enabler to the market. It's something as a backdrop that any provider can access, and it enables where the true competition is going to be, which is on the quality of what they do and on the price of what we do. Does that answer it?
And just to follow up on that, because I think you sneaked a sort of third question in there about the process, because that again, as Paul was saying, the finance will be what the finance is. But as a Green Deal provider, we have that relationship with the customer and the enduring relationship with the customer. The warranties of the product, if you've got a 5-year warranty on a boiler or 25-year on a solid wall installation. So that becomes part of the competitive offering. So for any potential customers out there, you are only dealing with one organisation, the Green Deal provider you've chosen. And we then in the background interact with any funder that's in place. So, it's still to be tested, but it's looking like a fairly comfortable customer journey from the customer's point of view.
And I suppose one final point following on from that is that it is a competitive environment. The Green Deal provider has the responsibility to organise the finance, but can go to any organisation to get that finance. The Green Deal finance company is setting itself up as a national aggregator to drive down the costs, but there's nothing to stop that Green Deal provider, if they can get it cheaper, the money cheaper elsewhere, to access that. And you'd expect them to do that in order to get the volume.
And there's a strong possibility that some may finance it separately, but they may come to us and ask us to do the administration, but not the finance, and that's understood. Because we are not a monopoly, we're just large.
And I guess the more that familiarity with the new asset class builds, and actually people can see what the risk-reward structure is of a investment in Green Deal receivables, you'd expect there to be more interest would come. But I think in the initial phase, I think you need to have that single source vehicle, but without crowding out the potential competition in the future.
Any other questions? Oh, we'll just wait for the microphones for the people at the back.
Sue Sweeney from Ayr College. You've mentioned that you are Scottish Power are going to be a provider for the Green Deal. So the big companies can be providers for Big Deal, and you said providers can be open to all. So what about the small and medium-sized companies? How can they become providers? On what guarantee do you have on the ability of those to be providers, to provide that quality? Now, I know that there have been some qualifications that are being developed, but I think they've only just recently become available. So therefore, you've got a time delay problem here in relation of training those people to be able to go into the homes and do the assessments, and so therefore to be warranted to be a provider. What does the panel think to that, and can you see a problem over the next few months in relation to that?
I think for all of the industry, the time that it's taken to get all the pieces in place, it's difficult. So regardless of whether we're big companies or not, or small companies, you have to have volume and time to train and work for those people to do. And the fact that the training and those courses have come out a little bit later is potentially a challenge. But actually, in terms of Green Deal plans not being accepted until sort of January, there still is very much time to do that. And the volume demands, I don't think, will be as great at the beginning, so you won't be as penalised certainly in the early stages. The accreditation process is open to all sides, and actually, if you look at the two registered Green Deal providers, they're not both of them large companies. There is quite a robust, and DEC have worked hard at this, a robust mechanism to go through different accreditation processes and training, but it takes time and cost, so I wouldn't dismiss that. But there is, I think, a mechanism to allow that, and actually the Green Deal Finance Company gives them a lot more power as well, because they've got a source for the finance, so that is an enabler in the organisation's advantage. I think as well, practically, there will be a number of smaller Green Deal providers that just go the assessor and installer route in the early stages and work through a network of a larger provider, and hopefully very healthy competition will mean that they'll grow their own businesses and then spin out on their own as they get larger. And I think using that local network, and certainly we will be doing in Birmingham Energy Savers to use SME and micro businesses to deliver, so you're part of a community solution. And that's great for all of the players involved. So I don't think any of the larger businesses are sort of afraid or are unwelcoming of that competition, and actually developing the competition within their ranks as well, because it's good for the industry to drive demand.
Yeah, no, I'd echo all of that. I think one of the key, if I just speak about our obligation part for a second, one of the key things that we need to do is work with local communities, whether it be local authorities, housing associations, stakeholder groups, to go out into the community and find these people that we need to help. And we're very happy to work with local small businesses to enable that to happen. The second point I'd say is the government and DEC have thought about that issue as well. So there will be still to be determined, but I think they're calling the brokerage. So all the energy companies will have to give a certain percentage of our eco money. So we'll put a big pot that then small businesses can bid into. So they can then get the subsidy. So they'll get the finance potentially from Pool, but the top up they need in order for the customer to hit the golden rule, they'll be able to go somewhere for that as well. So still to be determined the actual detail, but there's quite a lot of effort being done to ensure that the smaller players have a place in the market.
Just to add, as I understand it, 80 companies already have applied to become Green Deal provider. So that DEC's going through that process. So there's already, and that's not thousands of companies, but already a substantial. As it was actually linking to the last question on competition, but because we are not doing an accredited assessment of individual providers, and the cash becomes an enabler, any SME knows it can get the cash. So that does happen, as Siobhan said. So I think that's going to help competition and help SMEs is the plan anyway. And I think I would echo the comments on that a lot will choose not to become providers because what they don't want to take on is the long-term obligation to customers and the customer service that implies. So there will be this network. Just one other thing is local authorities, a number are now doing these schemes for procuring preferred Green Deal providers. So obviously the Birmingham is the first, but there are many other, Manchester, Newcastle, Leeds following shortly afterwards. Part of their evaluation criteria can be about local provision of jobs. So actually people that come in with a network and use local subbies gets evaluation benefit.
And I think that's why some of the local authorities are taking such a proactive approach in this area. It's not just about fuel poverty, it's around seeing certain CESP schemes ending. What's going to happen to our local employment and workforce, and how can we build up and help them to develop their skills? Good question. Any other?
Douglas Campbell, Dundas and Wilson. Thank you for a very clear explanation. It's most helpful. Anyone in this morning would have heard the Energy Secretary talking about the Green Deal as being an entirely new market. Forgive my ignorance, and it's probably a question for Callum, but as I understand at the moment, there are certain grants available from energy companies to do effectively the same thing, perhaps not all 46 technologies, but again, as far as I'm aware, they're underutilised. What extent do you see there being a market for this? If you're to pay for something that's currently free, maybe it's going to be withdrawn, but if you could talk us through that, I think it'd be quite helpful.
Yeah, I think there's probably three things that are currently happening, and apologies for the acronyms, but it's endemic in the industry. So there's a thing called CERT. So you get your free insulation offer, or somebody's ringing you up and offering you free insulation. So that's a thing called CERT. CESP is a more local scheme for the most deprived areas of the UK. And then depending on where you are, Scotland, England and Wales do it slightly differently. If you're an eligible customer, you can get a free boiler or a heating system. So I probably would challenge the point that these are underutilised. I mean, we have a target as an energy company that we've got to hit by the end of December. And if we don't, there could be penalties for us. So we and the industry, to be honest, are running very hard to try and hit those targets, with supply chain partners helping us do that. It is true that at the moment we struggle to give away free insulation. A few years ago it was £100, now it's free. It'll be a free TV if you take it, that sort of mentality to try and hit the target. So it's very challenging to do that, but we are working very hard, spending an awful lot of money. employing a hell of a lot of people out in the UK to enable us to try and hit these obligations. The change and the comment made this morning about it being a new market, yes, it's true that going forward we will do something similar. We will offer people either a subsidy or a free energy efficiency measure. But these measures are going to change in dynamic. So at the moment it's cavity wall and loft, and it's relatively cheap for an individual measure. Going forward it'll be the harder to treat homes. And this market is very immature in the UK at the moment. I can't remember the stats, something like 20,000 solid walls done a year, and that will need to flip to, you know, hundreds of thousands. So this will develop a new industry, and we're working with partners and I'm sure Carillion are as well, about developing the skills and they need to deliver that. And then the financing is new. Yes, at the moment you could go and get a loan to buy a new boiler. So you could do that today, but under the Green Deal, hopefully it would be more cost effective to do it, and you don't keep the liability if you move home. So I'd probably say it's about 50-50. 50-50, yes, for us it's carry on, help customers, you know, introduce them to energy efficiency measures, and then 50% something new, a whole new market that really needs to transform over the next 6 months.
I think, I'm sorry, I think it's, I mean, I'm in both camps in the sense of, yes, it's absolutely what our businesses have done and delivered for years. Delivering energy efficiency and climate change and fuel poverty aren't new, and there will continue to be subsidised policies, but what is newer is there's a shift in saying, well, actually, these subsidised measures, which, as Carmen says, you know, we all end up paying for because they come on the bill, actually these can stand on their own now, and these can pay themselves back, so let's treat them differently. And let's direct some of the subsidised measures in different areas, and then let's create a market competition for energy efficiency in a different way. And actually I believe as well that all of this noise and all of this discussion, which will hopefully, you know, keep cascading out into more everyday, you know, not everybody comes to a low carbon conference, but hopefully when people start going through different businesses and hearing energy efficiency offers and paying for it, will actually increase uptake. Because giving away things for free, we all walk by that every day. But if somebody can understand the model and link it to home efficiency improvements and changing windows at the same time they do their boilers, it's a new approach to the market, but it's the challenge that we're trying to solve isn't new, but we've definitely got to talk in a new, different way, and I think we've got a real opportunity here to actually be really engaging and pitch something differently. And actually, do you know what? Some sexy marketing and consumer guys going in and saying, buy it and sell it in this way, rather than ringing somebody, you know, and just trying to give something away for free. It is the new approach that will hopefully stimulate. I don't think it will be the only solution, but it gives us a number of mechanisms of subsidise, buy it outright, stick it on my mortgage, stick it on Green Deal because I'm moving out in 2 years. It creates a dynamic in the industry that hopefully will increase uptake.
In terms of market potential, there was a lovely typo in the DEX consultation document where it said over 8 million homes in the UK still have their lofts to be insulted, which I rather like. On demand, actually, I think there are two sort of different models of how demand might run, and I think both are probably right. One model is certainly the sort of Greg Barker model, which this is about home improvement. That a lot of this will actually make your house look warmer, feel better, and look sexier. So, you know, a lot of houses, sort of late 70s built with actually a sexy solid wall on, can actually look better, and I think that's right. And people like Kingfisher, B&Q, you know, that they'll be out there not saying here's some necessary lagging. They'll be marketing it as, you know, here's a home improvement. Do you want a kitchen at the same time? And it's all about home improvement. So a good chunk of the market, it's going to be approached in a completely different way. Then there is also the second bit, which is the stick, which is, I think, there's a degree of mandation that, or more or less of that can come in. The first one that is coming in is building regs affecting landlords, which kicks in 2015 to 2016. So properties of the lowest two rankings of energy efficiency will have to be upgraded, and landlords will have to pay for that. And clearly, if they can not pay for it because they can do it under the Green Deal, they will. So there should be some underlying demand for that from landlords. Government has also allocated £200 million to spend on early uptake incentives to try and encourage the market to get going and get critical mass. Then there are other opportunities that have been discussed but not implemented, which will be things like differential local council tax, differential stamp duty, and enforcing Green Deal measures as a condition for planning permission. You know, if you want a new conservatory you can have one, but you've got to do a Green Deal. Those are other sort of things being talked about but not yet implemented. But clearly, if the uptake is poor, and remember the Green Deal, just stepping back, the Green Deal is to try and make a large impact on our 2020 and beyond carbon reduction commitments. And if you're faced with the cost of either building new generation or just using less, clearly the last one, if it's self-financing, is the best way to go. So I would imagine more mandation may come in if demand is low at the outset.
I mean, one of the things we haven't said around Green Deal, though, that was very much focusing on domestic properties, and certain assessment eco is completely domestic. Green Deal covers non-domestic and municipal buildings, although I think the financing may lag. You may want to get the domestic working first. I mean, I don't know whether Adam or Paul, you've got any comments about where you see that market going in the longer term.
I think I certainly see the non-domestic lagging the domestic from a financing perspective. I think what we've sort of undertaken over the last year or two on this is trying to bring about a very complicated financing for residential, whereas residential, if you look at residences are residences whether they're in the north or the south, but industrial units versus offices versus fish and chip shops, there's just so much variety in the non-domestic sector, and you don't have a sort of one size fits all that you can apply in the residential space. I think what we have to do is get the residential piece financing right and at scale, and start to understand some of the dynamics, and then slowly move across into trying to apply the same size and scale of financing to the non-domestic. That doesn't mean to say that large non-domestic projects can't go another route, but I think if you're trying to apply the Green Deal Finance Company model, I think that is very much you have to establish it in the residential and then move into SMEs, move into sort of offices.
And there's some good news and bad news there. So, I mean, on the bad news, it's easier to do households because our finance is effectively finance of probability, which is you have a large number of households, you can predict default rates, problem rates, and we have a swathe of data from the energy utilities to help us do that and price it correctly. As Adam says, because companies are smaller and more difficult to predict, it's harder to use that model. But the good news is most companies have existing bank facilities which they could use for this. And the second thing, for most corporates, the payback is so much shorter because the energy efficiency measures can pay back instead of 25 years in 3 and 4. So a solid wall on an energy using warehouse can pay back in a fifth of the time that it would do on a household. So there's some good news is why that market actually might come up quicker. So our finance company isn't touching it, but I think a lot of banks will and a lot of corporates will do it themselves and avail themselves of that use.
I mean, I would support that. I think the commercial energy service market in this country is a little bit still immature, but jumping forward incredibly, and actually energy performance contract and, like Green Deal, but not attached in the same way. Green Deal is a good financing mechanism, but you can actually do a Green Deal without the Green Deal finance, if you like, almost by using EPCs, and then that maturity will come. So we're seeing lots of companies take measures, work out the payback, in you go, and it's the same can fine in it, and that's fantastic, and that's increasing in this country, which I think is very positive. But there's not the same drive or need for a huge aggregated model in the same way. But smaller investors and smaller pockets can do that, or the companies themselves.
Okay. Any other questions?
Jim Mather, Strathclyde University. What we're talking about here is delivering services to households and businesses. And there's a lot of evidence in literature now that suggests that waste creeps in where the time to deliver the service becomes protracted from the declaration of interest or the signing up for it to the installation being complete. Are there plans to measure that? Because if there are not, then there's a real danger that waste can creep into the system. And are there plans to benchmark one provider against the other in terms of those elapsed times?
I think that's quite an interesting one, and I suspect that might differ from it's a competitive market, so the industry can just play in this anyway, the likes of B&Q, and they'll have their own performance mechanisms in place. I think if you've got local authority models and partnerships, like Birmingham, there's more of an ability to build in KPIs, so I don't know.
the point is absolutely right, and I think for each of our perspectives it'll be slightly different, but you can imagine from a business, that waste hits us as well. It doesn't just hit the consumer, it hits us. So if our surveyor has to go out 4 times, or if our surveyor, or if we're carrying the cost on our books for 6 months, that, I was going to say something ruder then, but that affects our business model. Just checking where I am there. So, it's absolutely right that we need to look at those touch points. And we've started with here's the DEC process, and this is what the policy asks us to do, and quality and customer cool-off period, and all those things are absolutely appropriate and right. But we need to make sure that the touch points are as quick and tight as they can be, and pressurise our partners, etc., in the chain to keep those with us. There are some time frames in the policy itself, but a lot of them will be internally driven by the business needing to be efficient, and also the finance mechanisms itself. So I would say, I can't answer for across the industry, but we certainly have internal KPIs of where we have to hit our process, and then certainly the contracts that we work on will have their own KPIs, as will retail markets as well, what we have to turn around. And there are certain securities for the customers that always need to be protected, of course, but incredibly important.
2 other mechanisms worth mentioning. First one that we'll impose, and the second one that results from ECO, so maybe Adam can. But what we'll impose is, when somebody comes to us for a loan, for a quote for a loan, we will hold a price, but we're probably going to do that for a maximum of 5 weeks, which is giving them time to effectively do it, sign off the loan and get the stuff done. And the reason we're not doing it for longer is because it costs us money hedging and taking that interest rate risk. So we're not going to just say, well, it's name an interest rate and it goes on forever. We can't do it, because we'd have to double our interest rate. So to the extent that anyone takes any longer than that, they've got their risk on their own balance sheet that they can't deliver this, and they spend all that time with the client, and then they go to sign and find the interest rates move. So that will create that discipline. The second thing is more general ECO, and I'll also hand over to Cullen, but effectively there is a bidding war to get ECO. ECO is something that will be traded and will have a price to it, which will become clearer and clearer and more transparent over time, which is paying to the most economically efficient. So if someone says, if you give me £100, I'll reduce carbon by X, and somebody else says I'll do it 2 times X, naturally the ECO will start flowing to the person that does 2 times X. So the eco bidding will start to weed out those people who have inefficient processes, because by definition they should over time become less competitive.
Yeah, agree. And just putting on from an eco point of view, and I must admit I've not seen the detail, but up until now we've only really had to go back to Ofgem to say how much carbon we've saved. I think going forward we'll have to report that, but also how much it's cost us. So I'm not sure if it will be public available, but I think Ofgem are starting to take a bigger look in terms of our obligation, how much that costs for each company. The other thing I'd just mention, just talking about the Green Deal specifically, is we've spoken about this golden rule. So that the golden rule effectively is its own police mechanism for cost, because if when Scottish Power become a Green Deal provider, and I think I can make more margin, that'll be capped by the golden rule, and then it will either be Pool will only finance up until the golden rule. So it's in my interest to keep costs as low as possible, either to make sure more customers can benefit from it, or to ensure that myself and the supply chain have a reasonable margin in any particular job. So
there is a slight little fly in the ointment that's a little bit out of all of our controls on some projects. So obviously the customer's choice time, which, as I say, they absolutely have to have the right cooling off periods, but their choice. But also planning. So, and I'm just thinking, you mentioned solid wall earlier. Solid wall classically just takes a really long time to get through planning things. So I certainly wouldn't sit here and say, yes, I've resolved all those waste issues, because I think there are, just to be a little bit more, I think we've been quite positive, so I'm just trying to be a little bit more openly negative. There are some things that are still to be worked through.
I've got a secret ambition to have solid wall on, the Bath Crescent, that classic sort of Georgian frontage, but we know we'll get them.
Well, number 10, we're going to go for a conservatory. Maybe we should get them to get some solid wall as well.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
I wonder if you can just talk a bit more about the assessment process and competition and the assessment process, and correct me if I'm wrong. So my understanding is if someone gets an independent assessment, the customer pays for it. If someone gets an assessment from a Green Deal provider, that can be wrapped up in the Green Deal package. But obviously lower income people are relatively unlikely to just pay up front for an assessment, so they're more likely to be just tied to a provider. So can you just talk through how you view sort of the potential for genuineness competition during the assessment phase?
Yeah, I think it's a little similar to our earlier conversation as well as to who enters. So it's no one is asked to charge or not charge for a Green Deal assessment, so it will be a business choice as to whether you charge for that or not. Of course, you can imagine, I suppose, if you're an independent assessor, there is more of a likelihood for that independent assessor to charge unless they have a business model with somebody else where they're passing those on. But that's up to that company model. And it is important, obviously, that individuals understand whoever they go to, they can go to somebody else, etc. But on balance with that as well, is if everybody was giving away free Green Deal assessments and nobody getting the work, there's going to be a cost that eventually gets layered into there. So the independence or impartiality is important, and I think that there, with an increase in competition, you can't solve it completely because it's a part of a cost. And it's for those businesses to model it and for consumers to look at the competitors coming into the market and choose those. And I think as we go forward with the B&Q models, etc. as well, there'll be more of an association there and how that's done. But there's no requirement for anyone to charge or not charge. It is purely a business model.
Yeah. I don't know if anybody else has any comments on that particular aspect.
I think it sort of goes to an issue close to my heart as a bank, which is the mis-selling concern, which is something I've got a very receptive antenna for, particularly in the light of the PPI banking scandal. And I think it's an area that we are very focused on in terms of our due diligence and sort of working with Paul and team on this process. And one thing is very clear is that we've set up the policies and the framework of the Green Deal Finance Company such that there is, if an asset has been missold, then the Green Deal provider in question has to buy back the asset from us. If they've sold us an asset that turns out to have been missold and doesn't meet the golden rule or what have you, they're getting it back, and we're taking that money back. So that is a punitive measure, and we're sort of layering in other mechanisms to make sure that mis-selling is severely financially disincentivized and mitigated as much as possible.
And there are two key risks there. One, which you sell something that doesn't meet the golden rule, or one, you sell something that meets the golden rule to a household who's a low energy user.
Yeah.
So for them, actually, the price would have gone up rather than down, and you need protections to cover both of those.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Could you explain a bit more about how the golden rule will be applied, particularly with respect to energy price fluctuations, interest fluctuations, and the danger that will have, meaning 1 week a technology is viable, the next week it isn't, and hence supply chains not necessarily building up to be able to supply different technologies.
I'll take the interest rate first.
I'll go first. The interest rate on a Green Deal is fixed on the day you do it. So to that extent, it's a fixed, it's just what you'll do is you'll take out a Green Deal and then it's fixed and that's it forevermore. That creates hedging problems for me and Adam, but we do that behind the scenes. So that, if that disappears. For most measures, yes, measures might slightly change what they do on the golden rule, but if in general the Green Deals all benefit from a degree of eco, i.e. the eco is a balancing item that makes the golden rule work because the rest is financed by eco, you've got something there which actually can move up and down slightly. So if you take a large solid wall probably will not finance itself under the Green Deal. It'll always require eco. So the only real question is how much eco. And if the interest rate, because I can't control the underlying interest rate, if government puts up interest rates, I'll have to too. So if those go up marginally, at the margin, slightly more eco would be required for every solid wall. So there's a sort of self-rectifying mechanism being built into the structure.
So are we saying that as a consumer, if you easily meet the golden rule, you're taking those risks until you sign your from getting the quote at the Green Deal assessment stage to actually saying, yes, I'm definitely going ahead with it. Mm-hmm. But if you're actually on the margins and requiring eco, it's your eco provider who's taking the risk of all cost movements.
Actually, yes.
Until that's done,
Yeah, it's almost that the eco takes the risk, not the consumer. And there's a lot being talked about, what's the final interest rate and whatever, and actually what that means is the consumer might be relatively interest rate indifferent. The person that cares about the interest rate is Callum.
And just another point, that the assessment and all the things that we'll need to do to present a customer a Green Deal plan. I mean, it is true that it is a theoretical calculation based on that 12 months that at the time you're signing it. If I don't know, there's another oil crisis or all energy suppliers put their prices up after, a year later, that isn't factored in. So the customer effectively takes that, and we have to explain that to them so that we don't missell. But the customer takes that risk of inflationary energy prices afterwards.
Yeah, and two other things on the customer, which is, so there is a degree of inflation that is allowed to be built into the calculation. So to the extent that there was a reduction actually in energy prices, you may find you're slightly overpaying because you've worked out your golden rule on an assumption which doesn't transpire. But in general, the prediction on energy prices is so much far north that we shouldn't have that problem. The other risk that the customer has is a behavioural one, which is the second you make your house nice and toasty, you can either turn down your thermostat or strip off. And if you do the latter, your energy bill tends not to go down. And that's one of the reasons actually why the risk is with the consumer, not with the energy supplier, because they can't control nakedness in their customer base. And that's so sometimes the savings aren't realised for that reason. People behave differently. They enjoy having a toasty house.
And I think that it is important that we're clear that the golden rule isn't a guarantee. Golden rule is factored on the 12 months, etc. So you will have to counsel through, and it goes back to the independent assessor piece as well, in terms of the genuineness of an assessor and where they're earning their money and how long they're in the game for and how well they explain that. Because actually, as you say, behavioural changes, and we've seen this tremendously, even just putting solar PV on people's roof. People think differently all of a sudden, and it might not even be rational for somebody who understands the technology, but they in their home react a certain different way. So, if that house changes hands and etc., those things will fluctuate, and the behavioural piece is really important in that, and the energy efficiency advice you give is important in that as well.
Gen2 is a social landlord up in Newcastle, Sunderland, but interesting results. They actually found a lot of people that they were willing to pay more than their existing energy bill for the Green Deal measures, and that sounds slightly counterintuitive. They said the reason is on the fuel poor end, what you were doing is for a slight extra payment, there's a difference between three of you huddled around a heater in one room and being able to walk around the whole of your house. And for that, they would pay a £5 more, a month or whatever the figure was. So actually, counterintuitively, they would pay more for a Green Deal.
Okay. I think we've probably got time for one more question. If there is one. Yeah, across there.
Thank you. Brian Baker. In that light, could you perhaps, one or more of you, say a little bit more about the where the independent assessors are coming from and what training they'll be required to undergo, and how much there will be language skills involved? A lot of the key recipients, this is an assumption I know, a lot of the key recipients are going to be people for whom English is not their first language.
Is that a reference to the Sunderland bit that I'm talking about?
Sorry, I'm not an expert on the northeast of England. It's not an area that I know.
I think we should move away from the northeast quite quickly, having originated from there. So I don't know. Do you want to take that?
I'll openly declare our interest. Carillion Energy Services, we plan to have our own assessors because we think controlling quality and knowing what the person's doing and being very close to them is quite important. But where we need to, we would use independent assessors as long as we can be very guaranteed that they have been through the right accreditation processes that are enshrined in the policy and the code of practice, etc. And I'm certainly not by any means then dismissing that independent assessor isn't credible. It's just our control mechanism and quality mechanism for doing that. So there'll be lots of different companies that are coming up as independent assessors, and if we move to sort of subcontracting model, that is what we would do in terms of checking have they been through the right criteria, as well as then our own subcontract criteria that we check through in terms of quality, health and safety, and ability to deal with people with learning difficulties, language difficulties, people with different backgrounds, disability, etc. We have a lot of experience in terms of dealing with warm front and people in fuel poverty and vulnerable people, and there'll be a lot of care put into how you can go through community engagement and language skills. And I think that's really important, because although we switch between the two of saying it's really complex, it's really simple, you have to make it simple in the home and counsel people through what they're doing, and that includes language and people with vulnerable equations. So using community networks, making sure your independent assessors have got all the right skill set, and if you are going to an independent assessor, building that in your criteria to monitor and watch them. But we're seeing independent assessors coming out in all different shapes and sizes of small companies switching over from different things, and I'm sure many of them will do a fantastic job of it. We've just got to keep making sure they've got the right ticks in the boxes and the right checks for companies like ourselves if we use them.
I think we probably need to draw this session to a conclusion now. I want to thank you all for coming. Hopefully we've tried to explain that energy efficiency is simple, that it is a product which can be rolled out, but obviously quite a lot of dynamics of complexity below the Green Deal, and that some of the financing issues are completely aligned to the quality issues around protecting the fuel poor, around mis-selling, around the independent assessment. Can you just thank the panel, please, in the normal way? Thank you very much.